Morning.
Hope you had a great Thanksgiving. Today is webinar number 95, Friday, November 22nd, 2013. Uncle Pete, session number 17. What are we going to do? Part 1, right?
Yes, this will be part 1.
And we're going to, December and January, we're going to change this up. We're going to fake people out and do different times, probably Thursday afternoon, noontime, or even 2 p.m. What do you think? Something like that. We'll see if it make a difference. So, without any delay, go ahead and start up.
All right.
Thank you.
We once again appreciate you, Arnold, and I say pick the time that works into your schedule, and we will all work around it. So I thought this was going to be one article, but when I started putting it together, I realized that it's quite a bit of content to cover, so I've decided to do it as two-part article instead. So that's what we're going to do. Part 1 today. I'm going to give you a little introductory into zones, and you're going to see some of the deals of working with zones. And the main thing we're going to focus on is creating a PowerBar zone. And your first question is, what's a PowerBar zone? Well, if you've noticed, a lot of sites are going to a PowerBar. Google does, PayPal does, I think eBay is doing it now. Here's an example, WordPress. Notice how when I scroll this page, this menu bar at the very top always remains there. That's what I'm calling the PowerBar. And I can't take credit for that term. Google or PayPal or someone actually coined the phrase. So this is a site I've done for a client, and you will see our PowerBar implementation. So what's nice about that is it's very good for that very core set of functionality of your site, like view the cart, contact us, the sign-in controls. Putting those on the PowerBar means that they're available no matter how far down on the page they scroll. If it's a giant page that can scroll for a while, all those controls are always visible on the screen. And it gives your site just a little different look than the cookie cutter out of the box WebDev, grab the template, throw some controls on it look, which is always a good idea also. So let's break this page down so we know what we're creating here. As I've discussed, we've got the PowerBar at the very top, this dark gray area at the very top. Next, there is a page header. That's what these menus are. Then we have a left-hand navigation pane over here. This area here is the page content area, and if we go to a page that actually has content, we'll see that filled in. And then this area here is a page footer area. So we've got a total of 5 zones: PowerBar, page header, left-hand navigation, page content, page footer. And that's when we get all done with this 2-part series, we will have created a template to reproduce this kind of a look and feel of the site. And in that journey, we're going to learn quite a bit about zones, both how to use them and some black magic of how to edit them and so forth, because unfortunately, the way things work with our buddies at PCsoft, they give us some really great features. Sometimes their interface kind of falls And zone editing is one of the areas where they could really do some work on the editing, the interface to make our lives a little better. So, without further ado, let's get started. And what we're going to do is, sorry, let me start a new session of WebDev. We're going to create a project from scratch and go through all of our steps of doing this. So let's just create a project and call it something interesting like temp. No need to put it in the SCM. We're going to choose the iStyle skin. That tends to be the one I work with the most, and then by the time you get done, you don't know it's the iStyle template, but that's the one I've kind of landed on as my starting point for a lot of my projects. We don't need a database for this. And after a little churning, all right, and then we'll just close this. So now we've created our project. We've chose the iStyle skin. The next thing we want to do is create a template. And WebDev, this becomes very important. It's kind of best practice in WinDev that you create templates, and Ben's talk this afternoon. I love when Ben and I do these dual webinars. By happenstance, they seem to always dovetail really well. What he's talking about in the next session is doing templates and RAD templates and stuff for WinDev, which, like I said, is kind of best practice with WinDev. You can get away without doing it, but with WebDev, if you don't learn and work with templates and so forth, it's really, really going to get you, because there's so much more importance in zoning and positioning and stuff in WebDev that if you don't do that work at the template level so that it's consistent throughout your site, you're going to drive yourself nuts on every single page. So when I start a new project, the first thing I always do is start out by creating a template. We've already decided what our look and feel is going to be like. That's what we just looked at. I'm not saying that, I go out and peek around at other internet sites and pick one that has a look and feel like I want, but that may be what I do. So the template, and when we said create a new template, you see it gives us all of these predefined templates that will be skinned with the skin that we've selected for our project. So as you see, they've done a pretty good job of giving us all kinds of different looks and feels. And to me, I've never tried to create a template completely from scratch, because generally there's one here that is close to what I'm after. And it's always best that as a programmer, I've learned that, part of what makes me look good is I do a lot more grabbing something and modifying it than I do starting from scratch. So the one that looks closest to what we're trying to do is this inset to the left. So let's choose that one. Now, this is the way it starts out when we chose that template. And we can actually, let's go ahead and save this. And now we could actually test it by running the test a page button here. This button runs your entire site, which at this point we don't really have a site because we haven't created any pages, but we can actually test the template by doing the page test button. And let me drag that over for you to see. All right, so there's the way it looks. Definitely not what we're after as our final product, but once we go through a few changes here, we will get to that final look. You see that they are doing the centering of the page, which we are doing. It's targeted for that 1024-768 kind of width, which is pretty much 1024-768 or 1280-800 is kind of where I'm targeting most of my websites for nowadays. That seems to be a pretty safe number. You know, if somebody doesn't have a better display than that, they're probably not a customer of mine anyway. So it does have the general formatting of what I want, but it definitely, you know, it has these rounded edges, so the page is kind of floating on the background, doesn't have our power bar, et cetera, et cetera. So let's start modifying and see how close we can get it. All right, so the first thing we do is we come into the page itself and go into the descriptions. And if we come down to style, start with the browser background element. And we don't want a background color. That's where that gray was coming from that we saw. That's where this gray is coming from. We don't want that, so we set that to undefined. Instead, we're going to use a parchment paper image. And when I select that image, it asks me if I want to copy it into my project, and I let it do that. Now let's talk about that parchment paper image just for a second. Where I got that from, and this is just one of those little tip things for you. This website, Subtle Patterns, has all of these images that they're just small images that tile well. So they're perfect background images. And that's where I got that image from. So that site's called Subtle Patterns. So there's your little tip if you're looking for background graphics. So we chose the parchment paper background that I had already used on a couple other sites, and I've got a directory where I keep all of those standard graphics. Then we also want to tile that image because it's actually a very small image, but again, it's set up so that it tiles well so that it looks like one image once it tiles. So that's all the changes we need on the background. But the next thing we need to do, and notice this is browser background, which means the area that is not covered by our page. Now we want to actually adjust the page background and border. And this is what's giving it that rounded edge that we saw. See this shape of custom? If we come in here and look, see they've got round, diffuse, chose. So that's where that rounded look of the page is coming from. So we're not going to do any kind of page border or background. So we set the border color down to fine, background color down to fine, and shape to none. And the final thing that we need to do is if we come down to the margins, we'll see, and notice how there's this white space here between the edge of the page and where the content starts. That's these 18 margins that they set up on this template. If we change those to zeros, we will get rid of that margin. So now if we click that, see that we've already made quite a difference to the look of our page. Now, right now, our background is showing through because these sections, these zones were defined without background, so it looks a little hinky, but once we're all done, it'll look much better. If we do another test, we will see that something didn't work right. Try that again. There we go. I didn't save it before I ran the test. So we definitely see that we've had quite an effect on the look already. We got rid of the page floating on a page look. We got our parchment paper background. So we've got some general work done. Now it's time to actually go start working on the zones. So let's head back over here. Now, the first thing you'll notice in WebDev, and if you haven't played with zones, you may not have noticed this at all, but there are two little tabs up here, page and zoning. When you're in zoning mode, you're editing these zones instead of the controls. When you're in page mode, you're editing the actual controls. So you have to switch to zoning mode to work on the zones. And you'll notice that these zones are represented by these little red borders of the zone. So as you see, they've got a header area up here. Then they have a navigational header, a left side content area, and a footer area. So they have the same 5 zones that we're after. It's just that those zones are not defined the way we want them to be defined.
So Pete, the navigation area is separate from the header as far as zones go, right?
Yeah, it's hard to see, but see that little red line right there?
So it's 1, 2, 3,
There.
4, 5. Okay.
Yeah, there's zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, and zone 5. We could also see that if we come over here to controls, we'll see that the header zone is actually broken into 2 zones, and then the wrap zone is broken into 2 zones, and then the footer zone. So zones within zones, but and that we'll talk about that more next week. It gets really weird when you're trying to add zones and delete zones because at the end of the day, everything has to be contained in something when it comes to zones. It's not like cells that you can have a cell floating off somewhere. Zones, your entire page has to be covered with a zone. So it's a little different. They look just like cells in a lot of ways when you're editing them. A lot of the interfaces are the same, but there's certain things that are different, and the reason why is that the entire page has to be represented inside a zone. So at the end of the day, you always have at least one zone that covers the entire page. You know, if you do a site, don't create any kind of template or anything, you actually have a zone, whether you're aware of it or not, and that zone is the exact same size as your page. All this is breaking that master zone into subzones. So that's an important concept to understand is you're always breaking a zone into pieces. You can't ever just stick a zone in the middle somewhere. So that's it gets and again we're going to talk about that more next week. It gets very tricky when you start adding zones and trying to change the general layout. That's the reason we're very lucky here that this zone, this template basically has the layout we want. We just want to change the effect of some of those layouts. But it actually has two header sections, left side, a content side, and a footer side. So we're pretty close to what we want, and that makes our life much easier for us. So that's pretty well cover the basics of zones. You understand what we're looking at there?
Yeah, I think so.
All
But you're
right.
gonna,
Good
but
deal.
did you say you're gonna get rid of the navigation zone?
Not going to get rid of any of these zones because there's 5 zones, and remember we need 5 zones. So
Well,
we're just going to change all these zones to behave the way we want them to behave.
oh, so you're not actually gonna add another zone to do your top guy. You're gonna
No,
use one
because
of the others.
remember, if we go back, let me bring up the site again. We've got a memory leak on this server. It looks like it needs to be rebooted. It's slowed down again. If we go back to this page, this is what we're trying to get. There are actually 2 top zones. We've got this PowerBar, and then we have this page header. So we have that same 2 header zones. It's just that one of our header zones stretches the entire page and is fixed, where in their instance, the 2 header zones are just more or less behave the same.
Oh, I
So,
got you. So you're
we have the same number of zones.
okay. So you didn't add another one. That's why I thought you said 5 and go, whoa, don't you mean 6? But you're really using that header one to do that fixed top.
Right,
Okay,
exactly.
got it. Okay, thanks.
All right. All right. So, so let's start by, this zone here is going to be our power bar zone. It's the very top zone. So when we click on it, then we can do description, get into the editing mode of that zone. First thing we're going to do is rename it just for sanity's sake. Don't ask me why the default charter uses area for zones. I don't know. It must be one of those English to French to English things. So let's call this zone power bar, just so that when we look at the layout over here, it'll make a little more sense to us. All right. So that's step 1. Then we'll move on to the GUI tab. And this is where some of the magic is. And I'd like to give credit to who spurred me into figuring this out. And it was one of the guys. I don't know if it was John Figg, John Armstrong, Michael. One of those guys over on that side of the world was struggling with this fixed. And I had never seen this. This is new in 18. And once I started playing with it, I found that it's pretty cool. What it does is exactly what it says. It fixes this zone on the page. So we're going to fix it, and we're saying fixed plus anchor, and the anchoring is set to width, which those 2 things, that's what it says. Okay, stretch this the entire width of the browser. If we click on here, we see that width is set to adapt to browser. And then the fixed is what says, this zone stays on the page. It does not scroll off the page. And then if we move down to the style, we want to make the background color that dark gray. Actually, we're going to use the palette to get that, because it's always best to use the palette. That way, if we change the palette, the entire site will be affected. So we're going to use negative background 3 to get that dark gray color. We want it to be a solid background. So that's going to give our color of our power bar. All right. Now, one other thing, if we come back, and I don't think I have it up anymore. No, I don't. But you'll see in the header section, see this gray bar and the couple of little swoop images here? Those are actually coming from an image. This isn't a cell. You know, if you go back over there and try to click on it, you can never click on that cell because it's not a cell. It's actually a graphic. And where that is coming from is this background image right here. See, if we hover over that, see how it's got the swoops and stuff in it. So we get rid of that altogether because we don't want a background image. And we set the rest of these to undefined because we're not doing anything with the image. Now, if we run another test, we see that we're getting a little closer. We've got a power bar. At this point, the scrolling would work. That power bar would stay on the screen. Our page isn't big enough where we can really do that. But to test that, we could make our browser much smaller and see how that zone is staying there as we scroll the page. So we've got our fixed part of that working. But notice how our controls got stretched out to the entire width of the page. So, you know, we've got some anchoring issues there to address yet. Our zone's a little too tall, and we also have some of the wrong controls in our zone. So, a few things that we need to touch up yet, but we're definitely getting closer to the look and feel that we want. All right, so now let's fix the size of these two zones, because in our final product, if we come back and look, our power bar is not very tall, and then this header section is where our actual logo and stuff is going to live. Needs to be larger than what it is at design time, because right now it's only the height of that menu. So if we click on this power bar zone, if we look down here in the right hand corner, this is another one of those cool little shortcut tricks of WebDev, and it actually becomes very important when we're working with zones. For the most part, when you're dealing with stuff, you have these and you can edit there, but you can also go into description, GUI, and edit there. But notice with zones, it won't let us do that. This is another one of those, they've locked that out because they're trying to make sure that you don't accidentally get a zone not covering everything. But we got lucky and they did allow us to do it from here. So we want that power bar to be 35. How do I know that? Because this isn't the first power bar I've created. The magic of TV. All right, now we also need to make the page header, and we need to make it 80 tall because that's how tall this icon is, or logo, whatever you want to call it. So same thing, we click on that, and we change that to 80. So now we have our two zones the size that we need them. Now it's time to get the right controls on the page. So let's switch over to page, and definitely looking a little hinky at this point. So let's start by, let's grab the search stuff, move it down here just temporarily. Then we'll grab this menu, which is actually hard to grab because these controls overlap it. But if we click twice, we'll grab a hold of it. Now, one important thing to notice as I'm dragging these controls around, see that bright green border that is highlighting? That's indicating what zone this control is going to be contained in when we drop it. So if I move down here, notice how that zone turns bright green. So that's just another one of those little tidbits that's very good to know. So let's drop the menu there. Drag the logo down. Also drag company name down, and company name is defined as really tall. So that's just for really tall, really wide. So we're just going to shrink that up so it doesn't overlap the other controls. Now we can move our search button back up into our PowerBar. And these links need to be moved up just a little bit because right now they're overlapping into the other zone a little. All right, so now that's more the look we're going for. We've got the right controls in the right places. So let's take another look at what it looks like in test mode now. All right, so our PowerBar section looks like it's the right height now, but notice how our controls got all scooted over. We really want those controls to center up with the rest of the page. Do you have a question, Arnold? Okay, thought I heard the mic come on for a second. So we've got to figure out how to get these controls to stay centered up with the page. I have played with trying to set the anchoring on these controls to center it or something, and it just does not work out well because you'll wind up, as you stretch the browser and shrink the browser, they just don't stay even with the rest of the page. So the way that I've solved that is there are still times where we need a cell to contain stuff, because that once those controls are in that cell, then we can control that cell as a whole, and the controls within that cell stay in relationship to that cell. So if we put that entire PowerBar inside a cell, or I'm sorry, really the cell's going to be inside the PowerBar, but it's the exact same size as the PowerBar, then we put the controls in that cell, then we can set the anchoring of that cell so that that cell stays centered up with the page, and our PowerBar stretches, but that cell stays where it's supposed to be. So we start by going to the Creation tab, creating a cell, and we'll just drop it down here right now so that we can start working with it. And we don't want this background and stuff, so we're going to have to do some editing of the cell for sure. So let's go into description, and first thing we're going to do is name it something that we'll recognize later. We also want to add these controls to this cell. So let's use the Add button. And right now, those controls are setting in the zone. So that's where I found them. We just want to add them all to this cell so that they're contained inside this cell. You can drag and drop stuff to get it into a cell, but for the most part, that at times becomes difficult and unreliable when you have multiple zones and multiple cells. So this is just my way of making sure that those controls are contained inside that cell.
Too bad they make you do that one at a time like that, huh?
Yeah, yeah. That, like we again, we could have went out and drug and dropped them on, but like I said, that just becomes
It's not
not
like
as
you can
reliable as
select
you
them.
would
It's
want.
not like you can select them all and
Yeah, there's no multi-select
yeah.
here. Yeah,
Just what I
it's
do,
one
Arnold,
at a
is
time.
what I do is I select them all and I drag it, and then I come here and check it if it's in the right place.
Yeah, 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 and at times you find that everything didn't get into the right cell. Uh,
That's it.
yeah, my
Yeah.
uh, where that
It's
really
quicker
becomes a
than going one
problem.
at a time.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, where that really becomes a problem is when you have cells inside cells. Uh,
Oh yeah.
then it's very hard to get it to select the right cell, and so I've I've kind of gotten into this mode of doing them one at a time now. Of course, this was 5 controls. If it were a bunch of controls, then I would do the drag and drop and then adjust. Because the other thing you can do here, Arnold, if you get the wrong one in here, you can remove it. So you
When you
you
remove it,
can't.
does it go back to its original place, or it's just gone?
It all you're doing here is associating controls with cells. It
Yeah,
has no
the
effect on the
container.
control itself.
So it's just
Not the delete
changing
button.
containers, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the odd thing is, and before you get too excited here, like right now, you see that our cell is down here, and I've
Mm-hmm.
told these controls they're contained in that cell. That seems like a way for us to have controls contained in the cells that they're not actually visibly contained in. Uh, we can do that in the IDE, but every browser in the world is going to get very confused at how to display that page. So your display results are going to be incorrect. So at the end of the day, once you get all done, these controls need to be visibly inside that cell as well as being associated with that cell. So there's 2 steps to this process.
Gotcha.
You know, if you just associate them here but don't have them visibly contained, it's not going to be pretty when you run the browser.
Yeah. It must be visibly correct.
All right, so now let's switch to the GUI tab. And what we're going to do on the GUI tab for this cell is we want it to be horizontally centered. So that way this cell, we're going to make this cell the same size as the power bar. But remember, the power bar stretches. Our cell is not going to stretch because we didn't set it to stretching. We just set it to centered. So now it's always going to be centered. And since it's the same size as our power bar starts out as, now that cell is going to stay right over the top of the page and give us the effect we want. The last thing we need to do to get that is set our X, Y, width, and height. We know this is starting at the very top of the page, so X and Y are zeros. If we went over and looked at our zone, we would know that it's 116 by 35. So now we've got all of this. This is now defined as the exact same size as the zone.
Hey,
Yes, sir.
Pete, so I understand the height being 35 because you have that fixed, but you define the width to be the width of the browser, but you put a actual number there.
No, the zone is defined as the width of the browser.
Okay.
This one stays that width. So the PowerBar stretches out.
Yeah, Arnold's
The
is getting
PowerBar
confused.
stretches out.
Okay.
Arnold's
The
getting confused
cell,
between a zone and a cell.
right. Yeah, the zone, the PowerBar zone stretches out. This is a cell contained inside that zone. The cell does not stretch out. It stays the
Fixed.
initial
Okay.
size, which is the 1016. And that's how we get this magic of getting that to stay centered with the rest of the page so that
Oh, your
we
1016 is your the body below it, the zone below it.
this entire thing is 1016. And if we come back over here to if we come back over to zoning and select that power bar,
Yeah.
see it's 1016, and that's its initial size. Now it's going to get wider if your browser is wider, but it starts at 1016. We're defining that cell as being fixed at 1016, so that way, even though the zone stretches out, the cell does not stretch out. It stays at exactly 1016. That's what everything else is. So now it gets centered with everything else and stays centered in the page.
See, what threw me off is when you went, the starting point was coordinate 00, right? So if the browser was wider than this, it would be way, I thought it would be way over.
Yeah, again, all of this is runtime dimensions. So,
Okay.
or I'm sorry, design time dimensions. So at design time, it is 00. It's now it's then once the page gets rendered and stretched out, it's going to center it, but it's going to center it in relationship to where it was at design time. And at design time, it's lined up with the rest of the page. So these are design time coordinates that are then affected relationally by your anchoring. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the last thing we need to do is on the style tab of that zone, we need to we need to get rid of the border and the background coloring. Basically, we're making an invisible cell. And you may say, well, then why don't we just do this? Well, if we do that, the cell and everything in it becomes invisible. That's not what we want. All we want is to have a container, but we don't need that container to be visible. We are literally just using this as a placeholder so that we can affect all the controls inside it as a unit. So we just come into the border background and we set everything here to undefined and none. Now our cell is, in a practical intents and purposes, invisible. And we see that now. You noticed how when I clicked OK earlier, we had that white and stuff. That's because the cell had a visible color to it. Now it doesn't. And we may have messed up coming out. That's one of the dangers of coming out. Looks like we did. Fix some stuff here. 0. Because that still had a border, it adjusted its size. That's one of the dangers of it knew it had to be contained inside there, and it needed that 1 pixel for the border. So it adjusted the cell
That's a good point, because that was
automatically.
got you before was me.
That
cleared
yeah.
the match for me.
Yeah, what's even worse, in this case, it wasn't so bad because it adjusted the cell. Sometimes what it does is adjust your zone. And that's where things really go haywire is, it'll stretch your zone, and then that pushes all your other zones out of shape, and things really, really get bad. So
that's when you
so
use
that,
padding.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. That explains why.
And that's why you noticed
You gotta talk. Wolfgang, you gotta talk closer to your mic because you're like way in the background.
That's
Sorry, is it
If you
better?
noticed, I turned
Yeah.
off the margin. I set all the margins to 0. That's one of the reasons I did that, is because I want to be in control of where those things are positioned. When you use the margins, things get a little hinky.
Uh-huh. Now,
All
I had a
right,
bit of an
so
issue at one stage. I couldn't understand why things kept going wrong, but you've just hit it on the nail. You must watch out for the padding and the borders.
yeah,
Okay.
the borders add to your
Sub.
size.
Yeah. Okay.
When you're looking here at these dimensions, they don't include the border for whatever reason. So if you've got a 1 pixel border,
Yeah.
it's going to be 2 pixels wider and 2 pixels taller than these numbers, which kind of hurts your head. I think it might have been easier on us if they would just include the border into these numbers. That
Mm.
way, this would be exact positioning. But I guess the way to say it is that these numbers are relative to the border.
Yeah. There must be a valid reason why they do it that way, but it is a get you.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so now if we run this page, was there another question? All right, if we run the page now, notice we got our power bar, but we have nothing up there. Our controls are gone. We screwed up somewhere, right? We have just learned our first lesson of the idiosyncrasies of zones. Remember, we got that positioned up there by typing in this GUI areas here to set the positioning. The problem with that is if we hover over this, we see that, remember that cell started out down here in this section. We hover over it, it's still contained in that section. It's not in our power bar zone. It's in the area section. That's that exact thing I was telling you earlier with the cells. Same thing with the zones. Even though this all looks visibly correct, you saw the browser couldn't render it because it's trying to display it up here, but CSS position it within this section, and it just can't get there from here because those dimensions don't overlay each other. It can't render those controls where they need to be rendered.
Now, another way of putting it is where you created it first, and it was in the body section, and now it's still in the body section, even though you moved it.
Right. Now, the reason I created it down there is if I had created it up here, it would have pushed out. If I would have dropped the cell onto that zone, it very likely would have pushed out that zone to accommodate that default size of that zone or that cell. So I always create them in a area that I know isn't going to get pushed out of shape. It's just one of those things. When you're working with WebDev, you very quickly learn to be very careful about sizing your controls and stuff because your zones and things start moving to accommodate those sizes, and you get very unintended consequences. And that's the reason, for the most part, I try to edit everything via the GUI tab or these numbers down here because that does not affect your zoning and sizes. But the downside of that is it also didn't put it actually into the right container. So to solve that problem, we're going to grab this cell, drag it out, and once again, now you see the green bars, and we're just going to drop it. Actually, I found that this only works if I drop it somewhere else and then drop it back. If we run another test.
That's like a manual reset.
Yeah, basically. All right, so now we've got.
Hey, Pete, do you think it would have worked if you just you saved, went out, and came back in? Or do you have to really drag it in and out?
Drag it in and out. The problem is that it doesn't register that you've made a change until you
make a change.
Right.
So even a fix won't set it up right. A repair, I mean.
No, it has nothing to do with repairing.
Nothing to do with that.
I don't think. I wouldn't use repair to accommodate for that type of thing.
Okay. I think they got some logic that says, okay, you've dropped it back on the same place. You've made no change, so it won't update the variables location-wise. But I don't know. That I've noticed.
All right, something's still not quite right here. Now, see what would be nice, and I'll go back and figure out what we didn't do right, is, you notice zones and cells seem like the same thing. And you can tell that they used their code for cell editing to create the zone editing screens. And notice they're both these little blue boxes. But you see what's missing here? We don't have that add button. If we had that add button here, then we could do exactly what I did with that cell of forcing that association. So that's one of those little idiosyncrasies to zone editing versus cell editing that I really would like to see them make some improvements to this interface, and that's definitely one of those areas.
Pete, just quickly go back there and just stand on one of those lines, like the zone or the cell, and see if the buttons don't show up then. Just out of curiosity.
They don't. I mean, it just does not exist.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I just thought. Okay.
Yeah. No.
Okay. No problem. Just wanted to.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with zones. I've been banging my head against zones for the last couple of years now since they introduced them, and they get better every time. But like everything else, they still could go further. For some reason, at this point, we should be getting our centering working right, but it's like that cell has got the wrong anchoring on it. It says it's horizontally centered, but that's not even what's representing there. What's representing there is anchoring to the right. Let's change these to none so that we can see what's going on here. What I'm trying to fix is our zone didn't, or our cell did not center up the way it was supposed to. And I've got it set to centered. That was weird. But it's representing itself. Describing a cell PowerBar. Yeah, it somehow that anchoring got really confused there. I think us going in and out of it a couple of times got it a little confused. Let's see what we get now. Huh. That's weird. Oh, maybe. No. Ah. What happened, I believe, we're going to find out, is that got a 1 in that X, which actually made that cell not perfectly contained in our zone. And as soon as we get a situation where it overlaps the zone, the browser rendering just loses its mind because it just does not know what to do with that stuff. Yep, and there we are. So that's, I did all that to show you yet another little trick. It is, you see how subtle that was just by having a 1 here, and you really can't even see it on the screen because it's only 1 pixel. But what has happened is our cell is 1016, our zone is 1016, but we just told that cell to start at position 1. So now that cell is hanging over that zone. It's not perfectly contained in the zone. And when we try to do our rendering, it does not display properly. The reason why is because it's not contained properly in that zone, so we're getting unexpected consequences of that. So, and this is not the first time I've ran into it. It can be very subtle, but you just absolutely, and I've one of the guys on the group was having a lot of issues like this, and that was the thing that I was explaining, is that you can't have controls cross zones. All your controls have to be perfectly contained in the zone. If you have a control that is not contained in a zone perfectly, the browsers just are not going to properly render it.
And let's make that a golden tip.
You're going to have to translate that one.
Meaning that tip, what you just gave, is worth gold and a lot of hours saving.
Yeah. And like I said, it usually gets me on like images, like this right here. You know that if that's just 1 pixel off, you'll never see it on on design time, but it will absolutely get you. And I have at times had to sit down and start doing the math of, okay, this is 35 wide, this is 80 wide, or this is 35 tall, this is 80 tall. So that means this has to start in position, 116. If it's starting in 115, it's in the wrong place. So it can be very tedious, which is another reason why you do this on the templates. Unless you have one very special page on your site that you're doing something fancy with that you're never going to do on another page, absolutely create a page template. And generally, I have 3 page templates for my site. I have external template, which is the look and feel of what are the marketing pages of my sites. I have an internal template, which is the look and feel of the internal workings of the page once someone has logged on and got into the user menus and so forth. But, again, most of the sites I'm designing are business sites, so we have a external, 5 or 6 marketing pages. There's some type of SAS service, so once they sign up for the service, then they go into the actual functional part of the site. So there's a template for that functional part of the site. And then a lot of times I have a third template, which is the admin template for what the admin section, when me or whoever is the super user of the site logs in, they have a little different set of controls at the top or what have you on their pages. So generally I wind up with, at bare minimum, 3 templates for my sites, and then I usually wind up with more than that, but that's where I start at. So it's another one of those things that, and you guys have heard me talk about this before, when working with WebDev, always, it pays huge dividends the more work you do up front. It's really true of WinDev as well, but WinDev's a little more forgiving than WebDev is. If you don't do this work up front in WebDev, trying to get stuff fixed up and positioned right, and when you start running into multi-browser issues, if you haven't done all that positioning work at a template level, now you've got 30 pages that have weird positioning problems in Opera, and you're going to play with it and figure out how to get it to work right. And now you got to go apply that fix to 30 pages instead of the one template. So, I cannot harp enough on the use of templates as your starting point. And I will probably spend, depending on the complexity and the budget of a project, that first week there generally isn't a lot of output, and the reason why is that first week is spent graphics, look and feel, interface, templates, getting all that stuff exactly the way we want it to look and feel before we ever do the first real page of the site. And it's just the way it is. So at this point, we've got our PowerBar working exactly the way we want it. Now, one last thing. These links are pretty dark and hard to see, so let's go fix those up real quick. Now, normally, I would say the way to do that is to come in here to the style and edit that style. That way it would apply to all the rest of the links. But the weird thing is notice how that's grayed out. We can't edit this style. If this project were checked into the SCM, when we tried this modify button would have been grayed out, and we would have had to come over here to project, or I'm sorry, SCM, and on the style sheet here, we would have had an option to check out the style sheet. Once we checked out the style sheet, then we would be able to go modify that style. Apparently, if your project's not in the SCM, it's still looking to see if the style sheet is checked out to allow you to edit it. So I think there's some kind of a bug there. You know, it just, if you're not in the SCM, I should be able to modify this. I can't. So, and since this talk is really not about style sheets and that sort of thing, we're going to do it the down and dirty way. We're just going to come in here, change that to negative on the caption, and then you notice these little straight lines. How they're accomplishing that is a custom border, and they're saying they just want 1 pixel wide, and this one they've got the left one, and so we just come in here and we and make that negative as well. Whoop, messed that up, didn't I? I broke the, there we go. And we'll just apply that to the other ones as well. All right, one last quick look. And that looks a lot better. So at this point, we've got our PowerBar done. It's fully functional. And we're already 6 minutes into Ben's time, which is why I said, oops, this is going to have to be a two-parter. But the second part will be a lot easier. We're going to fix up the rest of these zones the way we want. They're all much easier to do than that PowerBar zone was. That the PowerBar zone took a lot more work. So we will cover that next week. And then I'm actually going to take you into a little bit of deleting and adding zones, which, you know, I will warn you now, there's a little black magic involved in it. It's that interface really gets goofy when you start trying to add zones and that sort of thing. So we will get into that. Yeah, and Ben's making a point there, and it's a very good point to understand. Is, you know, that like when I was showing you that control not being displayed because it was in the wrong zone, you know, that's not a WebDev problem. That's an HTML problem. You know, it's you know, it's just the rules of HTML and CSS don't allow those div sections to work that way. You know, we told WebDev to create them that way, and it did, but the browser isn't going to display it because it breaks the rules of the browser. So, you know, especially with WebDev, a lot of times we fall into this wanting to blame WebDev for issues that aren't WebDev issues. All right, so that wraps up this week. I will be back next week and we will finish up all the rest of our zones of this page and cover the really weirdness of adding and deleting zones. And at that point, you will be able to go forth and conquer zones, which if you're playing with WebDev, it is something that you definitely got to conquer. Otherwise, you're going to hate yourself. And I believe Arnold said that that's going to be Thursday. He'll make an announcement, I'm sure. But yeah, it looks like we are going to be Thursday next week. And I am done, Arnold.
Okay.
Unless we have some questions.
Keep it for next week.
All
righty.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pete.